Great. Well, let's just go ahead and get started, and some people may continue to trickle in. And if they miss anything, they can come back to the recording. My name is Daniel Farmer. I am the Climate Action Campaign Coordinator and Air Program Monitor Coordinator for PSRPA. And this webinar is a part of the work that we're doing with the Climate Action Campaign, which is a national campaign to fight for stronger environmental legislation and standards. And we've been talking a lot recently about extreme weather. And as we've all seen in the news, there have been a lot of extreme weather events, specifically things like hurricanes, flooding, and the list goes on, and we're only going to talk about a couple of extreme weather events in today's webinar. But I'm excited to share some of the thoughts and expertise of our two panelists. Our first panelist here is Dr. Erika Smithwick, who's a distinguished professor of geography and director of the Earth and Environmental Systems Institute at Penn State University. She's also an associate director of the Institute of Energy and the Environment. And Dr. Smithwick leads a new climate consortium effort at Penn State that aims to bring together interdisciplinary researchers in partnership with society to innovate climate solutions. She's also trained as a landscape and ecosystem ecologist, where her work aims to support sustainable land management decision-making around climate change. And she has particular focus on forest resilience to wildfire, which is something that we're going to talk about today. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Smithwick.
Thank you for having me.
And then we also have Dr. Pouné Saberi, who is a board member at PSRPA and a past president at PSR National. Her medical specialty is occupational and environmental medicine, where she teaches about climate change and health and the health impacts of climate change, both at University of Pennsylvania and in a lot of her other endeavors and organizations. And her interests focus on health impacts of environmental exposures and health benefits of transitioning to clean, renewable energy sources. So thank you so much for being here as well, Dr. Saberi. And we'll actually start with you, Dr. Saberi. So you're primarily going to talk about extreme heat today as an extreme weather event. And one of the extreme weather events that's less newsworthy and a lot more pervasive in some ways is something that we are sort of more consistently dealing with and feeling the impacts of. So can you talk to us about how does extreme heat, like what we've seen in PA over the summer, directly impact human health?
Sure, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I was thinking about kind of how to really focus on the fundamental mechanism of how heat impacts the body. And I thought that I should really start out with talking about how does the body deal with heat on a normal day, physiologically, how does that happen? And the body works really hard to keep the core body temperature really stable. That's why we can always say that, in clinical medicine, when you measure temperature, that it's 98.6 degrees or 37 degrees Celsius. That's 98.6 Fahrenheit, 37 Celsius. And then people might have slight variations, like, they might say, oh, I'm usually around 98 degrees, but it's very stable. So regulating this internal temperature is work that the heart and the circulatory system does, and it does it and we don't even notice it, on an average day. However, when temperature rises, the effort to regulate becomes increasing with increased work for the body, and it puts a strain on organs that contribute to this regulatory effort. And so when the body experiences heat, the blood flow to the brain is reduced, the blood flow to muscles are reduced, and the blood flow to organs are reduced. And these three phenomena lead to what we experience as symptoms of our body in the heat. So, for example, we might feel faint when it's really hot. That's because it's the blood flow to the brain has been reduced. We might experience, muscle cramps, for example. That's because the blood flow to the muscles are reduced. And then we might even experience, in extreme scenarios, damage to our vital organs like our heart and kidneys. So in summary, it's, the body does a good job of doing this on a normal basis, but when it becomes extreme heat, it puts extra strain on the body to do these mechanisms that are really truly physiologic and become pathologic.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that we want to highlight here is, the change overall is sure. But
Daniel,
about
your audio and your video are coming in very choppy, and we can't quite hear you.
Vulnerable populations, and what puts them more at risk? How are they uniquely impacted?
Okay. So sure. Not all of that came through, but maybe I'll just kind of talk a little bit about how the body responds to a high heat, why some individuals are more at risk, and I think you were asking about more vulnerable populations, like who are vulnerable populations that are higher risk of heat. So going back to the discussion that we're just having, all the ways that the body responds to heat that's described in kind of like it's described in a normal healthy body, and also in a condition where in a scenario where external conditions can be controlled. But what if there are circumstances that are outside of the control of that individual? For example, age. Age is outside of somebody's control. And older people have a harder time in what's called thermal regulation, this kind of phenomena I was just describing about regulating core body temperature. And then when they're older, in and of itself, they might be more likely to be taking medications. They might be having more chronic diseases, and then the medicines are helping the chronic disease, but the mechanism that they use, it does the exact opposite of what the body needs to do to maintain this. So being on certain medications, like medications that are used for hypertension, they're called water pills, for example, might make somebody more vulnerable to extreme heat. Other, conditions might be like pregnancy, for example. Pregnant women are more vulnerable. As we said, the body is shunting away blood from these organs, but it can't shunt blood away from the fetus. So that's another condition where that makes pregnant women more vulnerable. And then newborns don't quite have that thermoregulatory mechanism down yet, so they are also more vulnerable. Now, those are like examples of, body conditions. There might be circumstances that can create risk for people who are exposed to very hot temperatures that are environmental or social. For example, people who experience housing challenges and are sleeping in the streets, they are exposed to these elements and that they can't protect themselves from it. Another example are workers who have to wear really heavy, thick uniforms to do the job that they do. That also, makes them a lot more vulnerable to heat. And then athletes who play outdoors, they might be doing their sports for school or for a career. And so these would be scenarios in which would make people more vulnerable to heat.
Thank you. Sorry, I cut out there for a moment. Yeah, so when we're specifically thinking about some of these folks who are more at risk, whether it's for a specific medical condition they have, or it's the condition of their circumstances or the way that they live their life. What are some of the symptoms that people should look out for? And particularly, is there anything that we don't necessarily the general public doesn't immediately equate with being about heat, but maybe is related to some of the extreme temperatures that we experience now?
It's quite possible that people have, heard of some of these kind of heat-related, these conditions that are on the spectrum of heat-related illness. Heat stroke, heat exhaustion, heat cramps, heat syncope, heat rash, heat edema, heat fatigue. They're all on a spectrum, and while the kind of fundamental mechanism is the same, they really follow that this spectrum can include that where if you hydrate, cool yourself, that you can reverse it. But some of them can be emergencies, like heat stroke, for example. So those are the symptoms, the illnesses that people should really be watching out for. The other thing that also happens is that because blood is again moved away from the brain, it makes accidents and injuries more likely. People are a lot more likely to be prone to accidents and injuries. And then another phenomena that can happen is that because you sweat so much, the sweat is water as well as the electrolytes. And electrolytes are needed for normal bodily functions and especially your muscles. So you can get this condition called rhabdomyolysis, which is muscle breakdown. And that's marked by severe muscle cramps and pain. It's also been known, and we're going to talk a little bit more about kidney later, but some people are more prone to things like kidney stones, for example. So those are some of the health conditions that could be aggravated by heat.
Awesome. Thank you. I want to transition to Dr. Smithwick to talk a little bit about some of your work specifically related to wildfire risk. And I know we talked, in Pennsylvania, the experience we had with seeing all of the smoke come down from the Canada wildfires not so long ago was a pretty big shock in terms of extreme weather events in this region. But we also know that in the future, it is likely that wildfire risk in this part of the United States is increasing, and we are experiencing more of that with every passing year. Can you talk to us about how climate change is contributing to this increased risk, and specifically what that might look like in this region?
Sure, yeah, thanks. And, we had talked about a week ago in prep for this conversation, and in that time, we have actually had some wildfires here in Pennsylvania. So, you don't know how quickly this is coming until it's really on your doorstep. And I think we're not prepared for that here in Pennsylvania because we're not used to having climatically driven wildfires. But the truth is, we have the right factors sometimes when we have things like drought in the fall. If you have a wet spring and then a very, very dry fall, which is what we had in October, you set up the perfect conditions for wildfire. And so it may not be like it is in the Western United States. I mean, many of us may be familiar with the increasing pace and scale and impact of these very devastating wildfires in the West. And I can talk a little bit more about that because a lot of my work has been in that area. But we know that is out of whack with what those systems have experienced over the past 10,000 years. And we know that that's largely due to two factors. One, an increase in fuels because of fire suppression and the removal of cultural burning and managed fires in those landscapes led up to an increase in fuels. And then it's compounded by this increase in drying and hot temperatures that is causing increased fire risk. And as soon as you get those ignitions, which you're going to have with lightning, but also with a lot of people living in these landscapes. And so if you come to the east, you see a slightly different kind of scenario where you're not having as long of a dry season, but we do have potential for those conditions to occur, as we just saw this fall. And moreover, we are affected by the fires that are happening elsewhere. As you described, we had a couple of years ago, the massive fires from Canada come down right over the eastern United States. And it was a real wake-up call for many of us that even if the fires aren't happening in our area, we are affected by them. And, we can talk about the effects of the smoke itself on health. And if you remember even further back, I remember because I pay attention to these things, we also had smoke coming from the fires in the Western United States a couple of years before that. So this isn't just a one-off thing. I think we're going to start seeing this more and more and start preparing our communities for some of those risks. And in the East, what I think about a lot is the fact that we live in a very built-up environment. And you might think about in California, here on the news, or other parts of the Western United States, it's 90% contained, 60% contained, 35% contained, and that goes over for weeks and weeks until the fire is kind of out. If you get a large fire in the East, it could cut across the state of New Jersey in a day, right, and be in the border of Philadelphia. You just don't have the same amount of time, and we have a lot of people and infrastructure in place in the Eastern United States because we're not planned to live in a fire-prone environment. So all of those things mean that even if we have slightly lower fire risk on average compared to some other areas in the Western United States, the potential impacts could be large. And we're going to have more sustained impacts from these more distal fires as well.
Thank you. You mentioned this, the unique challenge of how built up and dense our environment is in the Eastern U.S. and the challenge that has the challenge that represents in terms of containment. Are there other unique challenges for Eastern forests and communities in this part of the country that we face as wildfire risk increases?
Yeah, there are. I mean, we call it the Wildland Urban Interface. For short, we call it WUI, which is a horrible acronym, but it's basically this mathematical formula of how many homes are near places that have higher fire risk. And it turns out Pennsylvania is like 5th in the country in terms of having the highest WUI. And you don't think about that, right? Because our fire risk is relatively lower. But that's where we're saying, like, even if you get these fires, they're more likely to be intermingled with infrastructure and homes. So that's the big one that we think about. And so that affects several aspects of the fire cycle. First, it affects the potential for the risk to that infrastructure and to those homes, of course. It also actually promotes more ignitions, too. So you have more people in these landscapes. And increasingly, the ignition source is, not lightning, it's people and debris burning, debris pile burning, for example, or train sparks, or campfires. These are the kinds of things, even fireworks. That's a big source of fire all over the country, but especially in places like the East, where you have a lot of people living in these landscapes and not thinking about fire as a particular risk factor. So you have ignitions, you have the potential impacts of risk, and it also limits the ability to plan for fire and to plan cohesively for any kind of fire preparedness. And I've been working a lot with prescribed fire managers in the region, and they have talked about the inability to kind of manage at landscape levels. If they could manage cohesive tracts of land using safe managed fire to reduce fuel loads and restore habitats for all sorts of other good reasons like game hunting and habitat restoration, they could be doing a lot more proactively to reduce the risks. But we have multiple jurisdictional boundaries. We have multiple agencies. Pennsylvania has so many different townships and boroughs and counties that it makes it really difficult to plan for those prescribed burning strategies. And so that also kind of constrains us in being able to be proactive. And then I'll say, too, that we in the West, because they have been living with wildfire for a lot longer, there has been a community awareness and education about what it means to live adjacent to wildfire-prone areas. We haven't had that history in the past several hundred years in the East. And so that means that we don't have the social capacity to help guide decision-making around things like planning or zoning for fire communities. So, for example, retirement communities with one way in and one way out kind of plans. It's very hard in an emergency situation to get high risk populations out in a situation like that. We saw that happen in the Gatlinburg fires a few years ago, where in that case, it was tourist homes and more resort style locations, but one way in, one way out. We're not planning for that. We're also not doing the home preparedness planning that you might do in the West, where you are actually creating safe spaces around your home, removing debris piles, metal roofs, sort of common sense things. Like even my parents who live in Western Massachusetts, putting their wood pile right next to their house because, why not? Easier to fetch the wood, but a big fire hazard should you have that risk. So again, we're not in an emergency dire situation with our fire risk right now, but we are concerned about in the future how frequently those drought conditions are going to come. We're going to be wetter in general, but we're also going to be more variable in our weather conditions, which means also more drought. And so that's actually some of the frontier research right now is how often and how frequent are those climate conditions likely to come, because that could put the East in a different kind of situation than we've seen in the past.
Thinking about the impact of smoke specifically as having been an event that was, again very shocking for folks in this part of the country, and we also know that has a clear health impact on residents when we're living in a smoke-filled environment. So how does wildfire smoke that reaches Pennsylvania impact our air quality and public health?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I like a good campfire more than anyone, probably, but you also know you don't want to be sitting on the side where the smoke comes, right? You want to be on the other side. It is difficult to breathe when you have, this smoke in your face. And why is that? Well, it turns out there's all sorts of processes associated with combustion of wood and vegetation that causes harmful and often toxic constituents to be released in the smoke. So we're talking about particulate matter. PM 2.5 is one we often talk about, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, but also things that we might associate, say, with fossil fuel combustion, but essentially fossil fuels are just old vegetation. Things like benzene, formaldehyde, other kinds of aldehydes, and these have, and lots of metals too, heavy metals get released in this process. And so you're essentially inhaling that material into your bodies. And science has shown, and Pouné could probably talk to this as well, that it can go through circulatory systems, respiratory systems, and have the same kind of vulnerabilities to people who might have pre-existing conditions, the young, the elderly, and pregnant women. And so there are real concerns about the toxicity of smoke. What's also important to know is that it now, especially if we're talking, say, for the smoke that's coming from the West or coming from Canada, it's spending a lot of time in the atmosphere before it gets to us. And what that means is that it has more time to transform, to interact with other chemicals in the atmosphere, and interacting with other things like ozone, which further breaks down and creates other kinds of toxicities. And so that's happening. And then the other thing that's happening is that increasingly we're not just burning wood and vegetation, we are also burning the built structure, the built environment. We're burning homes. And guess what's in your home? You have diesel tanks in your home. You have chemicals in your sofa, hopefully not so much, but you do. You have paint cans. And so all of those are getting mixed into the just wood-based, vegetation-based smoke as well. So that's extremely hazardous. I mean, there are stories like in fires in Colorado where even if your home wasn't burned, it's still not livable because the toxic fumes that came into your home makes your house actually toxic. And from a kind of environmental policy, management kind of perspective, these are not regulated. Now, we know some of these chemicals and constituents do cause cancer and have been noted to cause cancer and are regulated in some instances, but not in the instance of wildfire. If the source of these chemical constituents is the atmosphere, in the atmosphere comes from wildfire, it is actually not regulated by any federal agency. It could be regulated, as I understand it, if it's coming from a point source industrial solution thing, but we've never in our policy considered the fact that these chemical constituents could be coming through a natural event. And so that's a real opportunity for policy and legislative change.
Thank you. Thank you both. There's a lot of information that I did not have that you shared. And I'm sure folks who are watching this, I do want to transition to think a little bit more about what can be done about all of these impacts. There's certainly a lot of information here that is concerning and means that we need to do something about it. It means that we need to begin to build resilience and think specifically about what can be done. I want to turn to you, Dr. Saberi, about how communities can prepare to address these health impacts. You know, so you're specifically thinking about increasingly severe heat waves. What can communities do to prepare to address?
So one of the first things that I think would really benefit individuals and communities to do is to understand weather conditions. I want to take a minute to kind of really break down and unpack what I mean by that. So for example, you know, in terms of like, you know, what Erika was just saying, that the wildfire is composed of, you know, all these other components. So understanding what all these components are. The same thing with weather and heat. Temperature is not the only variable that impacts how the body interprets heat. You know, you all can, you know, kind of vouch for the fact that like 90 degrees in arid conditions, you're in New Mexico, you can tolerate that a lot better than if you're in Florida, you know, because when it's humid. So and the reason for that difference is that when the body sweats, the sweat evaporates and cools the body, but that happens less when your ambient air is already humid, you know, and not much evaporation of that sweat happens. And so people feel a lot more hot in humid conditions. And the factor to kind of look out for is either called dew point or relative humidity. And you can have that both for outdoor conditions as well as indoor conditions. The other factors are the wind, angle of the sun, and solar radiation. You know, I'm sure you're not surprised when I mention wind because it's hot, there's a cool breeze, and people feel good. They're like, oh, that feels really good. And then the flip side, of course, is that also true in that when it's cold and you get the wind chill. So wind actually does play a role in how you interpret heat and cold. But you know, in this scenario specifically, you know, in terms of how much sweat is evaporated from your body, and then the angle of the sun is in the sun at midday in the summer it feels a lot hotter because it's overhead, but rather than in the fall when the angle's a lot lower in the sky. So again, the angle of the sun matters. And then lastly, when I think of solar radiation, I think of how bright the sun is. And the way I might want to explain that is that like you're walking down a street, one side there's shade, one side there's sun. This is like summer. You're a lot more likely to go walk in the shade. You know, even it's the same temperature. The temperature didn't change from one side of the street to the other side of the street. You know, but your experience of that changed because now you're not exposed to solar radiation. So all of these, kind of, and so it's important, I think, for people to, really understand, these and to follow them and to be aware of them and to check them, because it makes a difference in terms of, knowing kind of the things that, that person, that individual, that community is exposed to and what their vulnerabilities are. And then gauging what the conditions are, and engaging, how they should behave in those weather conditions. I would say that the two measures to mention in terms of, how this information gets communicated is one is called the heat index. That's, temperature and humidity. The other one that's really used around the world is called the wet bulb globe temperature. That's kind of like, a lot to say, usually sometimes you'll just say wet bulb. And then, and there's apps and weather channels that provide this information. And, I really would encourage people to prepare by knowing and understanding these variables.
Great. That's very helpful.
And I don't know if you want me to specifically talk about businesses, Daniel,
Sure. Yeah,
because that's like a whole nother thing altogether.
let's hear it.
So I kind of, I haven't really talked a lot about workers. Now, I'm an occupational and environmental medicine physician, so my, specialty is to focus on workers. And they're a very important category in terms of heat-related illnesses. One reason is that, extreme heat can really lower the ability of certain classes of workers to do their job. And, a lot of people's livelihood determines on their job. And so this threatens their livelihood. The other part of it is actually from like a business perspective is that it lowers productivity. So it's costing businesses money, when workers are exposed. Outdoor workers, like construction workers, are at high risk, again, because they're working outdoors, and so they're exposed to, these kind of extreme heats. But there's other, categories as well: farmers, firefighters, park rangers. And if you recall, when I was talking about, like people who have to wear a lot of, thick uniforms, think of firefighters, think of like the amount of equipment that they also have to carry, and then, add these, hot conditions to it. Outdoor workers are not the only ones that are, at risk of, if you think of restaurant workers and the ones that work in the kitchen, for example, they're near fire. And if it's, or near, sources of heat rather. And so if it's really hot outside, and then if you're inside in the kitchen, it's also really hot inside, then there is no respite, for those workers. So this is the reason, or one of the reasons this is really important is because one of the first kind of the sentinel medical conditions related to climate change and global warming was described in sugarcane workers around the world. And it's a condition that came to be called chronic kidney disease of non-traditional origin. It's kind of a mouthful. But what happened was that it happened in people who were engaged in these, very physically demanding work, and then they suffered heat stress, and that led to kidney failure, dialysis, and for many of them, death. So it actually became a very, very serious condition that, has, that really needs to gain adequate attention globally. And while it's, mostly it's, happen, like I said, in other countries, it can also be happening in some of our southern states as well. So in terms of, what can businesses do is they really need to understand these affected workers, and that when heat waves, have been declared, they need to incorporate frequent breaks in shade and offer hydration. And especially if they're in an area where that happens all the time, where there's heat conditions all the time, then that just needs to be part of, the regular daily, schedule that workers have. And then there's also medical surveillance programs that they need to implement. And by medical surveillance, it means recognition of, heat-related illnesses in their workers, stopping it, and then having them seek immediate medical help. So those are some of the things, that like on the business side can be done.
Great, thank you. Dr. Smithwick, I want to come back to you. We mentioned in your introduction that you're leading this new climate consortium at Penn State. What is the role of this consortium in addressing climate-related extreme weather events?
Yeah, thank you. We're really excited about it. This is a new effort. It just is officially launched in fall of 23. Never too late, right? But what we're trying to do is coordinate and amplify, uplift, organize all of the work that's already happening at Penn State in the topic of climate change. So we have had over the years, over the decades, experts in climate science or system science excuse me, that are, nationally and internationally renowned. But we also have experts in the social sciences, in the built environment, thinking about resilient buildings and adaptive architecture, thinking about medical sciences, thinking about policy. And so what we really wanted is for everybody to have a home to find each other, and for us to work together towards societally relevant solutions. So the idea is to have our research not just stay within academia, but really be usable by communities. Given the urgency of the problem, we really want to make sure that research that we're doing is effective and most helpful. And so we identified 10 themes to organize around, and they include things like climate and health, or change and risk. It includes indigenous and traditional knowledge systems. So it's really, really broad. We're a big place. We have multiple colleges, multiple campuses. So it's really hard to, be as comprehensive as possible while still give it coherence. But we really do feel that these 10 themes give weight to the expertise that we have at Penn State, but also are a mechanism, an umbrella for non-academic partners to come to the table, and so we can sort of convene conversations around these areas. And what we're finding, even at Penn State, is that let's take the issue of climate and health. We have expertise in the social sciences, thinking about the social determinants of health, whether that's your livelihood, or whether it's your demographics and other kind of medical vulnerabilities, where you live. So what are the social determinants of health? We have experts doing this work. We also have experts in Hershey Medical School and on the medical science side, thinking about the specific physiological impacts. We have folks in health and human development. I mean, we were just talking about heat risk. We have some scientists who are working in that space. And we have the climate scientists who are developing the models and the tools. And, they weren't really talking to each other. And a lot of the climate solutions already exist if we can put our heads together and try to really, work together in this interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary way, where we're bringing partners in at the very beginning of the research design strategy. So that's what we're all about. We have a climate solutions symposium every May. It's going to be this year, May 19th and 20th, located at State College at Penn State's University Park campus. And it's open, it's free, and we really welcome the listeners to come join us because we're doing some exciting things here.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. What initiatives or research coming out of the Climate Consortium is directly relating to Pennsylvanians and our climate resilience and environmental health?
Yeah, we're really excited about our program called the Climate Solutions Accelerator. This is a program that requires two opportunities of funding, a level 1 or a level 2. Level 1 is workshops, essentially, to grow partnerships. And we require in the proposals that faculty will have identified non-academic partners that they will be working with on their problem. And then level 2 is 2 years of funding for those teams, including the non-academic partners as collaborators, to come together to try to scale those solutions. So this really is where that sort of high level that I was talking about in the last question, we really put it to test or to the ground. And we are just announcing now our first round of these level 2 proposals that went out. I should say our level 1s, we had over 230 participants across 11 different workshops, which was really exciting. And then our level 2, we funded 4 projects, things like socially responsible forest carbon offsets, which has direct relevance for Pennsylvanians because we have a lot of private forest land. We have a large extension unit at Penn State, and we have faculty trying to think about how to engage smallholder private landowners in the carbon market. What does that look like? It turns out that this is a challenge, it's a global challenge, and these faculty are working across the Atlantic transect all the way into Central America and finding similar kinds of challenges there. But then how can you take those lessons to grow a carbon economy for landowners here in Pennsylvania and do that in a just and effective way, socially responsible way. Another project that we're funding is looking at comparisons between a state like California, where climate planning for water shortages is mainstreamed across agencies. How have they done that? What has been effective? And what does that mean for states like Pennsylvania that have differential mandates around climate, but we have a climate action plan for the state? And how do we coordinate? How do we kind of have that be mainstreamed across all of the agencies? We have another team that is a multidisciplinary team looking at how do we get clinical faculty and clinicians trained in some of the climate work, and then having the knowledge to be able, as they're interacting with vulnerable populations. So things like using our Pennsylvania community health centers and our area agencies on aging and providing trainings to the people that work in those settings around the climate issue. So exactly what Pouné was talking about, like we want that kind of training involved and really strengthened across those community areas. So it has a lot of implications on rural health in particular. And then another one, not so local project, but it's focused on indigenous communities in the Amazon and what kind of environmental monitoring can be done in this area. These are communities that are faced with environmental contaminants from fossil fuel extractions from large oil leases in otherwise very pristine areas of and untouched areas of the Amazon forest. And how can you use this combination of indigenous knowledge of where these areas are being affected with sort of Western science of documenting PFAS, these forever chemicals that are coming from the fossil fuel industry? And then how do you work with fossil fuel companies to sort of share this information back and say, how are you going to fix this problem? And that, that kind of broader lesson of how you work together across those communities and sectors is something that does scale back to places like Pennsylvania. So those are some of our projects that we're funding. And this is a trial, but we are really excited because we are seeing a lot of energy from our faculty, from our students, from our partners to do work that really has relevance in society.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Saberi, I want to come back to you to think more broadly about public health strategies. You gave some excellent examples about what businesses should be doing, even about communities and what are some tools that they can use. But what are some larger public health strategies and even policies that you would like to see implemented in Pennsylvania or even at the federal level to protect vulnerable populations from heat-related risks? You're muted.
There we go. Right. So speaking of the fossil fuels, that Erika was just talking about, really, it's the number one policy that should be addressed is the burning and the dependence on fossil fuels. That is, like anywhere you slice it, that's really the number one issue that should be faced head on. The heat waves are getting worse because of the fact that human activity is reliant on the energy sources that send greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere. And so if we want people not to suffer from heat, not to suffer from wildfires, we really have to transition to, clean sources of energy. So that really, that has to be really, on the focus of that. But that is, you can kind of like put that in the category, of mitigation. We also need to implement adaptation strategies. So, for example, while some states have this, many people will be surprised to know that the U.S. does not have any federal regulation that protects workers from effects of heat. And this, again, heat is a really bad work hazard, and it goes beyond public health. It can hurt economies. So this is really kind of like a no-brainer to have. And for many, many years, there's been many efforts to introduce a heat standard, but it has been met with many barriers over the years. However, finally, OSHA has proposed a rule called Heat Injury and Illness Prevention in Outdoor and Indoor Work Settings. This will put in place a federal heat standard to protect workers from heat stress. Now, this was uploaded to the Federal Register on August 30th, 2024. The comment period ends December 30th, 2024. So whether or not it will be, in fact, made into a rule will remain to be seen. I don't really know what to say about it in terms of, kind of the new administration that's coming. However, I would really encourage everyone to comment on this because it's a very important rule. And even though it's really not as rigorous as it could be, the possibility of it being met with a lot of challenges is very high. So that's, one thing to look out for. But besides, kind of this proposed rule, there's a lot of other things that local administrations can do. What they really need to do is recognize their at-risk populations. For example, people with housing challenges and environmental justice communities, and systematically offer solutions as a respite from heat. Often in a lot of EJ communities, they don't have access to the same conditions as more privileged neighborhoods. For example, tree canopies. Trees they do a great job of cooling. However, many inner cities suffer from, heat island effects because of the lack of, these kind of natural cooling mechanisms and resources. A lot of homes, in EJ communities, in lower income communities, they don't have the proper ventilation and cooling, and so they're not as safe, you might say. And the people who are residents in these communities, they spend a greater percentage of their income on paying for utilities. And so they might have to make choices between like paying for groceries versus, cooling their homes adequately. And so, so some of the things that, like, for example, local administrators can do is make sure there's like cooling centers available, and then they themselves becoming related with different heat-related illnesses, and then, offering community services that can help people make their homes more resilient to these changes as a form of climate adaptation.
Excellent, thank you. And yeah, regarding the proposed OSHA rule, at the end of this, we are going to share a link for you to, well, two links, one for you to comment on the OSHA heat rule to try to put pressure for its finalization, and also a petition to encourage President Biden to take action as far as worker protection against extreme heat before the end of his term. So we definitely will encourage you to make a comment, sign that petition, and then also share that through your networks. It's an easy way to make an important impact in this moment. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Dr. Saberi. Can you also talk about some of the longer term health impacts of frequent exposure to extreme heat and what this will mean for public health in the future?
Yeah, really the thing that what I want to say about this is that it's a little bit kind of like when we talk, what Erika was talking about, the effects of on air pollution, and is that often people think, like, for example, air pollution, you inhale it, so a lot of the health effects are on your lungs. They are on your lungs. However, what they don't know is that how much of it impacts your heart, for example. It's a big cardiovascular risk. So same thing with heat. Often people think like, oh, heat, like you feel hot, you feel, faint, maybe even kind of like think about the impact on the organs, on the kidneys, etc., on the muscles. Like we said, what they don't know is how much extreme heat levels can be a mental health issue, can cause mental health issues like aggression, conflict, and depression. And that has been very frequently reported. Construction workers report psychological distress caused by working in hot conditions. Firefighters report increased anxiety. Other kind of various occupations experience, they report experiencing heightened psychological distress when exposed to occupational heat stress. So what I want to say about it is that, like, if we think mental health is in crisis now, it'll be much worse in a hotter future. So that's one of kind of like the overlooked public health effects of extreme heat that, I want to make sure I have stressed.
Yeah, thank you. And then Dr. Smithwick, one more question before we address it. We have a couple questions in our Q&A box that I want us to have some time for. Is how can local communities work together with institutions like Penn State and with other institutions to mitigate the health and environmental impacts of wildfires and other extreme weather events?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's things you could do at multiple levels, right? If you are an individual, things like actually being aware that there is fire risk and being careful with what you're doing with combustion. So not having fireworks in the middle of a dry wooded area, for example, or not doing debris burning if possible. So minimizing those ignition risks is something that everybody can do because you don't want to be that person that causes that wildfire, right? And there are lots of other ways we can enjoy combustion in a more controlled way. So that's the first thing you can do. And also protect your home, right? So if you are living in a rural area that is surrounded by woods, then you experience the drought that we experienced this past October, this past fall, that you can start to think about, okay, well, am I prepared? What if a fire were to come close to my home? And there are resources for you to learn about how to, remove vegetation right next to your house. If you are in the situation where you're replacing a roof, make a choice that might be more fire protective. So those are things you can do as an individual. As a community, you can actually start planning for this. And maybe I'm jumping ahead to one of the questions here in the chat, but things that communities can do around zoning is really important. So considering about how we're building and where we're building and how, are we building in areas that are increasingly fire prone? Are we thinking about emergency routes, not just from fires, but from other emergency events where people have access to leave quickly? And particularly focusing on residential, on communities that might be more vulnerable, like retirement communities, for example, or hospitals. And then communities can also apply, this is very common in the West, but not in the East, to become a FireWise community. And this is a way in which there are resources to help communities with this kind of planning and with educational resources. Essentially, it will support community liaisons so that municipalities can work with communities directly on the education and on the awareness of the wildfire risks. And so that's a resource that's open and available to communities now, is to qualify to be a FireWise community. And there are communities like this in our neighboring states, in New Jersey, for example, that work with the New Jersey Forest Fire Service directly, but also with some of these retirement communities. So there are models in our local region. We just haven't really been thinking about it for Pennsylvania. And then I think the other thing I would just say is to really pay attention to what's happening with our land managers, because they're doing great work. The Game Commission, the Bureau of Forestry, these folks are on the ground every day. They understand the ecosystem. And in our conversations with them, and then in talking with community members, when community members see what a prescribed fire is and see that these people know how to control it, and that if there is smoke, it's not necessarily because there's a wildfire, it's because trained professionals are there putting fire safely on the landscape to prevent a wildfire and promote other ecosystem benefits. Like being aware of what's happening and not immediately saying, hey, there's smoke in my backyard, but trying to understand, well, maybe there's a management plan here. Maybe there is a reason why these managers are out here, and start talking with them and having a conversation, because you'd be surprised what these land managers are doing to help steward our landscapes. And I've been very impressed in my conversations with them. So those are just a few things top of my head.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, we can just roll right into the Q&A questions, and I know you began to address that, but this question of, is home insurance or zoning going to be a way we regulate where homes at risk of wildfires will be allowed to be built? Is there anything more that you want to?
Well, I didn't address the insurance question, and that's a really good question. When we think about flood, I mean, we haven't talked about other risks to Pennsylvania landscapes from climate change, but flooding is actually probably our #1 risk. Flood risk is a big conversation right now. We do not have good flood risk And that's because a lot of these sort of natural events aren't covered with normal flood insurance. So even if you live in an area that has, and you might have flood insurance, it's not necessarily going to be covered by some of these extreme events. So that's the first thing to know. We don't really have the equivalent even for a wildfire kind of event. So that's a big open area of conversation. But the one thing to consider in this is the fact that a lot of this risk is going to be happening in rural areas. And in rural areas, imagine you have higher wildfire risk. You might also have lower incomes and lower ability to pay for that extra insurance. And so it's something to, be weighing from an ethical perspective. Is it the insurance market the way to buy ourselves out of that risk portfolio? It might end up with other kinds of injustices, the people that are paying the price for that security. So I think we need to think at a higher level of coordinating and mitigating that any kind of insurance policies that may have undue consequences. And also recognizing that insurance markets are pulling out of areas like California when they're seeing some of these extreme events coming in. So there needs to be some security that those will be sustainable solutions.
Thank you. And then the next question we have is, what is the state?
Daniel, I just wanted to just quickly mention something about that, because just today, I had, or maybe it was yesterday, that there's Zillow put out this report about how 90% of home buyers are looking at climate risk data for the homes that they're buying. So it's definitely entering the mainstream as a variable to consider.
Thank you for adding that. That's high. Okay, what is the state of medical and nursing education regarding climate change and health, and how knowledgeable are healthcare providers about climate and the impacts of wildfire smoke or heat exposure on their patients' health? Dr. Saberi, I want to turn this to you initially, and then please add anything you'd like. Dr. Smithwick after.
Yeah, sure. So I would say that, so while incorporating climate change and health education into medical schools and nursing schools has not become the norm. It is a lot more so than it was before, mainly driven by the request of the students and their, desire themselves to learn about it and to, want to have it be part of their curriculum. So it's in fact very much driven by the students themselves, and that the curricula exists in kind of like various formats, where it could be like an elective, it could be its own, course, or it could be kind of like part of what the students are learning already. I will say that it's quite likely that nursing education is further along, than the medical education in incorporating that. I will also say that the healthcare professionals who are already in the field now, they are, I do not consider them to be very knowledgeable about the impacts, of these climate events and extreme weather events. And that, even though the American Medical Society, for example, has kind of like recognized it, and there's, the medical consortium that focuses a lot on, kind of like unified curriculum, et cetera. We have a long way to go in really raising the awareness about the importance of the knowledge, making sure that providers feel confident, in that knowledge. And then lastly, how to apply it. Like, let's say you do know that, heat affects people, or, wildfires, the smoke affects, their health. Like, what does that mean for your day, for that like clinical encounter? we at PSRPA, we did create a tool. It's called O Career, that walks people through series of questions that bring out the kind of these salient points in order to address what puts somebody's health at higher risk for, how does the risk get multiplied, by these, maybe climate determinants of health, we can even call it that. But however, I would say, we have a long way to go, but we're a lot further along than what we were.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise and recommendations. This was extremely helpful, and I think a lot of things that many of us are not completely aware of or don't have our heads wrapped all the way around. So thank you. And to those of you listening and watching, following this, we are going to share that comments link and that petition that I mentioned. And we're also going to share another tool that the Climate Action Campaign has put together to easily call whoever your representative is in Congress to ask them to defend climate change. We are worried about where climate action at the federal level is going to be in the next administration. And so we want to make sure that we are consistently encouraging our elected officials to take actions to support mitigation of climate change, to support as stopping as much pollution as is possible, and making clean energy transitions, and ultimately protecting the health of people in this state and across the country and around the world. I mean, really. So we'll be sharing those links, and we thank you so much for listening, for watching, and again, thank you so much, Dr. Smithwick and Dr. Saberi. The work that you do is so important. And thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
rest
you
of
very
your
much.
day. Bye.
Bye-bye.